Welcome to True Crime Kin channel, where we dive into real stories that shake the core of human relationships. Today's case is one of shocking betrayal, twisted emotions, and a tragic ending that no one saw coming. So let's begin. Julia and David hardly seemed like the perfect couple. Living in an upscale suburban home, they had a strong social life, successful careers, and a seemingly happy marriage. David was a high-powered advertising executive, often traveling for work, while Julia worked as a freelance interior designer, spending most of her time at home. To their friends, they were a power couple, the kind of relationship others envied. David had recently returned from a business trip to Milan, Italy, where he was finalizing a major campaign for a luxury fashion brand. He'd been gone for 2 weeks, and while Julia missed him, she understood his work demands. However, something about this trip felt different. David had come back distant, more evasive, and his usual attentiveness was replaced with an air of distraction. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. She noticed subtle shifts, late-night texts, whispered phone calls, and the way David avoided looking her directly in the eyes when they spoke. Her suspicions began to gnaw at her, though she tried to push them aside, convincing herself that it was just the stress of his job. But deep down, Julia knew there was more to the story. She just didn't realize how dark the truth would be. One evening, while David was showering, Julia's curiosity got the better of her. She noticed his phone lying on the kitchen counter, unlocked. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. What was she hoping to find? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Work emails, messages from colleagues. But then she saw something that made her stomach drop. An unfamiliar contact with only a first name, Isabella. Hesitating, Julia opened the chat. It was filled with flirtatious messages and intimate photos of a stunning Italian woman. The text detailed a passionate affair that had begun during David's trip to Milan. The woman in the photos wasn't just anyone. She was a well-known Italian model, and the messages were explicit, filled with promises to see each other again. Julia's heart raced, her vision blurring with shock and rage. She scrolled through the conversation, piecing together the sordid details of their romance. David had spent nearly every night of his Milan trip with Isabella, wining and dining her, staying in luxurious hotels and lying to Julia the entire time. In that moment, Julia's world shattered. Her husband had been leading a double life, and the betrayal cut deeper than she could have ever imagined. The next morning, Julia could barely contain her emotions. She replayed the messages in her mind, anger simmering beneath the surface. But she knew she had to stay calm. If she confronted David too soon, she wouldn't get the answers she needed. Instead, she pretended nothing was wrong, watching him closely as he went about his morning routine. David, oblivious to Julia's discovery, kissed her on the cheek before leaving for work. Julia's skin crawled at his touch. Once he was gone, she sat in silence, her mind racing with the possibilities. What had gone wrong in their marriage? Why had he betrayed her like this? And most importantly, what was she going to do about it? That evening, Julia confronted David with a calm, collected fury that surprised even herself. She waited until they were tweeting down for dinner, the air thick with tension. "Who is Isabella?" she asked quietly, not even looking up from her plate. David froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. His face drained of color as he realized his secret was out. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, David set his fork down, his hands trembling. "She's no one," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Julia's voice grew colder. "Sleeping with her for 2 weeks was a mistake." David's silence was answer enough. Julia stood up, her chest heaving with anger and hurt. "I trusted you. I gave everything to this marriage, and you threw it all away for some Italian model." "I'm sorry," David pleaded. "It didn't mean anything. I swear. I love you, Julia. It was just I got caught up in the moment. Please, we can work through this." But Julia was already gone, mentally, emotionally. She had hurt enough. Over the next few days, Julia felt a numbness settle over her. David tried to apologize, swore he would never see Isabella again, but Julia couldn't bear to look at him. His betrayal had ripped apart the life she thought they had, and now every moment they spent together felt like a lie. But in that numbness, a dangerous idea began to take root. Julia wasn't going to be the helpless, heartbroken wife. She had devoted years of her life to this man, and now she wanted revenge. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became. David had to pay for what he'd done. Her first step was to research Isabella. The more she learned about the model, the more she seethed. Isabella wasn't just a fling. She was a glamorous woman, adored by many in Milan's fashion scene. She had the life Julia had once dreamed of: fame, beauty, and the attention of Julia's own husband. The affair had been more than just a casual mistake. David had been intoxicated by the allure of Isabella's world, a world where Julia had no place. But that world was fragile. Julia knew that fame came with a cost, and she could use that to her advantage. A week later, Julia received an email from an old friend who worked in high-end travel. It was an invitation for an exclusive fashion event in Milan, the very city where David had met Isabella. As if fate was giving her the perfect opportunity, the event was one of the most prestigious in the world, attracting top models, designers, and influencers. Julia smiled to herself. It was time to take her revenge to the next level. Feigning forgiveness, Julia told David she needed time to clear her head and that she was taking a solo trip to Milan. David seemed relieved, eager for any sign that their relationship could be salvaged. He didn't ask questions, and Julia didn't offer any answers. Little did he know, this trip was about far more than healing. In Milan, Julia would confront not only Isabella, but the darker impulses now simmering within her. The plane ride to Milan was both exhilarating and terrifying. Julia had never imagined herself capable of such dark thoughts, but the more she dwelled on David's betrayal, the more her desire for revenge grew. Milan, with its stunning architecture and stylish people, was the perfect backdrop for the confrontation she planned. As soon as she landed, Julia checked into one of the city's most luxurious hotels, the same hotel David had stayed in during his affair. She felt a twisted satisfaction as she walked through the opulent lobby, imagining him here with Isabella, thinking she would never find out. Once settled in her room, Julia began her preparations. She had already secured a ticket to the fashion event, which would take place in just 2 days through her contacts. She learned that Isabella was scheduled to walk the runway for one of the top designers. It would be the perfect moment to strike. But Julia wasn't planning on a simple confrontation. She wanted to destroy Isabella publicly, thoroughly, and she had a plan to make that happen. The night before the fashion event, Julia made a reservation at an exclusive rooftop bar frequented by Milan's elite. She knew that Isabella often visited the bar with friends and colleagues after runway rehearsals. And tonight she would be there. Julia dressed in a sleek, elegant black dress and made her way to the bar. The night was cool, the city lights sparkling below as she sipped her drink, waiting. After an hour, her patience was rewarded. Isabella entered the bar, her presence commanding attention as people turned to admire her beauty. For a moment, Julia felt a pang of insecurity. Isabella was stunning, and it was easy to see why David had been captivated by her. But that insecurity quickly morphed into anger. Isabella had knowingly slept with a married man, and now Julia would make her regret it. As the night wore on, Julia carefully positioned herself near Isabella's group, listening to their conversations and waiting for the right moment. When Isabella briefly left her friends to take a phone call, Julia seized the opportunity. She approached Isabella with confidence, her heart racing. "You must be Isabella," she said, her voice calm but sharp. Isabella turned, surprised but polite. "Yes. Do I know you?" Julia smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression. "No, but you know my husband." Isabella's face paled as the realization hit. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "Oh, I think you do," Julia replied coldly, stepping closer. "David Hartley. Ring a bell. You slept with him while he was on a business trip here in Milan." Isabella's eyes darted around the bar, clearly panicking. She tried to maintain her cool exterior, but Julia could see the cracks forming. "Listen, it was a mistake. I didn't know he was married." "Liar," Julia snapped. Isabella's face paled as the weight of Julia's words sank in. Her once confident demeanor crumbled into a mix of fear and guilt. I didn't know he was married, she stammered, her voice trembling. Julia leaned in closer, her eyes dark with rage. Her voice venomous but calm. Don't insult me, Isabella. You knew exactly who he was. I've seen the messages. I've seen the photos. You didn't care. You thought you were special, didn't you? That you could take him from me. Isabella took a shaky breath and looked around, but the glamorous people in the rooftop bar were oblivious to the tension brewing between them. She tried to steady herself, but the cracks in her composure were undeniable. It wasn't like that. He came after me. It wasn't serious, she mumbled, a desperate attempt to absolve herself. Not serious. Julia's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like glass. You think it wasn't serious to me? To my marriage? My life? The Italian model's eyes filled with shame, and she backed away, her hands shaking. I'm sorry, Isabella whispered, the apology weak and hollow, as if she had rehearsed it before. I never wanted to hurt you. Julia's lip curled into a smirk, an expression that sent a chill down Isabella's spine. Oh, you've hurt me all right, but I'm not the one you should be worried about. Not anymore. The intensity in her voice made Isabella feel as if she had just stepped into a trap she hadn't seen coming. Isabella blinked in confusion, her brow furrowing as the full meaning of Julia's words began to sink in. What do you mean? Julia stepped closer, so close that Isabella could see the fire in her eyes, feel the heat of her breath. This isn't about apologies or fixing things. You ruined my life, and now I'm going to ruin yours. You don't know what you've unleashed. Isabella's eyes widened with panic. What are you going to do? You'll find out soon enough, Julia whispered darkly, her voice laced with malice. Without another word, Julia turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Isabella standing frozen in the middle of the bar. Shaken to her core, Isabella knew in that moment her life was about to spiral into something far worse than she could imagine. The fashion show the next day was a glittering spectacle of wealth and beauty attended by the who's who of the industry. Isabella, despite her rattled state from the previous night, managed to maintain her stunning grace on the runway, walking in a shimmering gown that captured everyone's attention. But underneath the glamour, she was terrified. Julia's cryptic threat haunted her. And every camera flash felt like an accusation, every stare like judgment. Julia, seated in the audience, watched Isabella intently, her thoughts dark and calculated. The event wasn't just about Isabella's career, it was about reputation, image, and the public eye. Julia knew this was the arena where Isabella thrived, but she also knew how fragile that success was. One slip, one scandal, and it could all come crashing down. After the show, the after-party buzzed with excitement, models, designers, and media mingling under the city lights. But for Isabella, the champagne tasted bitter. She felt eyes on her everywhere she went. Every whisper seemed like it was about her, and Julia had already put her plan into motion. Unbeknownst to Isabella, Julia had hired a private investigator weeks ago. The investigator had unearthed everything about Isabella's private life. Her previous affairs, her ties to shady businessmen, her history of manipulation, and even a dark scandal involving an older man that had been covered up by her modeling agency. Julia knew it all now, and she was ready to expose every filthy detail. The first strike came in the form of an anonymous email sent to several fashion journalists. The email contained sensitive information about Isabella's past, including explicit photos and damning details about her previous relationships. Julia didn't just want to hurt Isabella. She wanted to destroy her career, her reputation, everything that defined her life. It wasn't enough to confront her in person. This was about complete public humiliation. Within hours, whispers began circulating. By the time the party was in full swing, Isabella's phone was lighting up with panicked calls from her manager, her agency, and fellow models. The media was starting to piece together the scandal, and the internet was beginning to buzz with rumors about her involvement. With not just David, but other powerful men, the timing couldn't have been worse. On the night of one of her biggest career moments, her downfall was beginning to take shape. Isabella, overwhelmed, tried to leave the party early, but she was stopped at the door by a paparazzi ambush. The flashbulbs blinded her, and the shouted questions were too much for her to handle. She pushed through the crowd, her mind spinning with panic, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Watching from the shadows, Julia smiled to herself. This was just the beginning. As the scandal spread, Isabella's world began to crumble. Her once supportive agency distanced themselves, suspending her from future shows until they could assess the situation. The fashion magazines that had once hailed her as the next supermodel removed her from their upcoming covers. Designers who had fought to have her walk for them were now avoiding her calls in less than 48 hours. Isabella's glamorous life had begun to disintegrate. She had become a pariah, her name synonymous with scandal. And while the affair with David was certainly salacious, it was the revelations about her past that truly ruined her. The affair was just the spark that ignited a much larger fire. Isabella, desperate to salvage what was left of her career, flew into a panic. She called David, demanding answers, accusing him of leaking their affair. But David was equally blindsided. He swore he hadn't told anyone, claiming he had tried to bury the affair to protect both of them. They argued heatedly over the phone, their voices filled with fear and desperation. Neither of them could figure out how the information had leaked, but David soon realized the truth. It was Julia. David had severely underestimated his wife. He had assumed she would be hurt, maybe even leave him. But he hadn't imagined she would be capable of such cold, calculated vengeance. He hadn't thought she had the stomach for it, but now he knew, and it terrified him. David's own world was beginning to spiral. His affair with Isabella, once a thrilling secret, had now turned into a nightmare. His marriage was on the brink of collapse, and his career, too, was in jeopardy. Julia had begun sowing seeds of doubt within David's professional network, subtly leaking information that painted him in a negative light. Clients began questioning his professionalism, and soon enough, rumors about his infidelity reached his bosses. Desperate, David tried to fix things with Julia. He offered therapy, a fresh start, even begged her to give him another chance. But Julia's cold indifference only made him more paranoid. He realized that his wife was no longer the woman he had known. She was something darker, more dangerous. She was methodically tearing his life apart, piece by piece. One evening, after a particularly tense argument, David decided he couldn't take it anymore. He knew Julia had orchestrated the leak about Isabella, and he feared what she might do next. He began contemplating something drastic, something that could end this nightmare once and for all. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, Julia uncovered something that shocked even her. Isabella wasn't just David's affair partner. There were others. Julia had hired a hacker to dig into David's personal accounts, and what she found was beyond her worst suspicions. David had been unfaithful throughout their entire marriage with multiple women, and Isabella was just the latest in a long string of conquests. The knowledge shattered whatever remaining sympathy Julia had for him. David had betrayed her over and over again, all while pretending to be the loving, devoted husband. The rage that had simmered inside her now boiled over. She had only planned to destroy Isabella and ruin David's career. But now she wanted to end David entirely. Julia began plotting her final move, a plan so devastating it would leave David and Isabella's lives in ruins for good. Julia's plan took shape with terrifying precision. She decided that it was no longer enough to destroy their reputations. She needed to make a statement that no one would forget. The idea that had been brewing in her mind took a darker, more sinister turn. She orchestrated a final, explosive confrontation. Julia invited David to a peaceful dinner at their home, pretending that she wanted to talk about the future and potentially work things out. David, desperate to regain control of his life, agreed, unaware that Julia had set a trap. Meanwhile, she also contacted Isabella, pretending to be a reporter interested in hearing her side of the story regarding the scandal, offering her a way to clear her name. Julia suggested they meet at the house to talk things over, leading Isabella into the same snare. The night came and Julia's stage was set. David arrived first, nervous but hopeful that he could somehow salvage the wreckage of his life. Julia greeted him with a cold smile, offering him a glass of wine laced with a strong sedative. He barely noticed the bitter taste as he sipped, trying to calm his nerves. Minutes later, Isabella arrived, confused but eager to defend herself. She didn't even realize David was there until she walked into the living room and saw him slumped in a chair, barely conscious. "What is this?" Isabella gasped, her heart racing as she looked from David to Julia. Julia stood between them, a knife in her hand, her face expressionless. "This is where it ends," she said softly. Isabella backed away, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "What are you talking about?" "I gave everything to this man," Julia whispered, her voice low and dangerous, "and he took it all for granted." "You both did." David, groggy and barely able to move, tried to speak, but the words slurred as the sedative took full effect. He struggled to lift his head, his vision blurring. "Julia, please." Julia turned to him, her eyes cold. "You destroyed everything, David. You made me into this." With terrifying precision, Julia walked over to him, the knife glinting in the dim light. She plunged it into his chest without hesitation, the sound of the blade slicing through flesh, punctuated by his strangled gasp. Isabella screamed, frozen in shock as she watched the life drain from David's eyes. Julia turned to her, blood dripping from the knife. "Now it's your turn." When the police arrived hours later, they found the scene of a horrific crime. David's lifeless body lay on the floor, a pool of blood around him, while Isabella sat in a corner, sobbing uncontrollably, her hands covered in blood. Julia had called the police herself, framing the scene as a violent argument between David and Isabella that had escalated out of control. Julia, calm and composed, played the role of the shocked, heartbroken wife who had walked in on the chaos too late. Her performance was flawless, and the police believed her story. Isabella was arrested for David's murder, her life in ruins, her career over. As she was led away in handcuffs, she screamed that it wasn't her, that Julia had done it. But no one listened. Julia had covered her tracks too well. In the end, Julia got everything she wanted. David was dead, Isabella was ruined, and no one suspected her. She walked away from the wreckage of her marriage with a cold satisfaction, knowing she had exacted the perfect revenge. And as she stood at David's funeral, watching the mourners weep, Julia smiled to herself. The game was over, and she had won. 2 weeks after the funeral, as the dust of the scandal began to settle, Julia started to notice things weren't as clean-cut as she thought. Isabella's arrest had garnered intense media attention, and the press hounded Julia relentlessly. She was still playing the part of the grieving widow, maintaining her mask of innocence, but whispers began to swirl. Rumors that the story didn't add up. Some questioned how Isabella, in such a fragile state, could have committed such a brutal murder. One evening, Julia received a letter in the mail. No return address, no stamp, just a plain white envelope left on her doorstep. The contents were simple. A photograph of Julia standing over David's body, holding the knife. She hadn't noticed anyone in the house that night, but this photograph meant someone had been there watching. A note was scribbled on the back of the photograph. "I know what you did." Julia's blood ran cold. She had meticulously planned everything, ensuring no one could trace the crime back to her. And yet this image was proof that someone had seen her kill David. She wondered who had been in the house that night and why they hadn't intervened. And more importantly, why were they coming forward now? Fear gnawed at Julia. She tried to brush off the letter, convincing herself that it was a prank, perhaps sent by a journalist looking to rattle her, but the photograph haunted her. Whoever sent it clearly had a leverage over her, and she had no idea what their endgame was. Julia began looking over her shoulder, checking her phone, her car, and even her home for any signs of tampering. She hired a private investigator to dig into any possible witnesses or loose ends from the night of David's murder, but nothing came up. It was as if the person who sent the photograph was a ghost. As the days passed, the tension mounted. Then came the second letter. This time it wasn't just a photograph, it was a demand $500,000 or the photo goes public. Julia was trapped. She had the money. David's estate had ensured that, but the thought of handing over such a large sum to a blackmailer without any guarantees terrified her. Who was this person? What did they want beyond the money? Were they just starting with blackmail, or was there something more sinister at play? And then Julia's mind went to a darker place. What if this wasn't about money at all? What if this was about revenge? As Julia dealt with the blackmail, a new problem emerged. Isabella had been sitting in jail, awaiting trial, her life in shambles. But she wasn't going down without a fight. Her lawyer, a sharp, relentless defense attorney named Vincent Moretti, began poking holes in the prosecution's case. He'd managed to dig up inconsistencies in Julia's statement about the events that led to the murder. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial at best, and that Isabella had no real motive to kill David. Moretti painted a picture of a woman who had been manipulated and misled by a powerful man, who then became the scapegoat for a crime she didn't commit. During pre-trial hearings, Moretti started to question Julia's role in the entire situation. He suggested, albeit subtly, that there was more to the story than the public knew. He hinted that Julia might not be the innocent widow everyone thought she was, and this suggestion caused murmurs in the courtroom. The media, always eager for a twist, began speculating whether the grieving widow might have had a hand in the murder. After all, Julia could feel the walls closing in. Between the blackmailer's demands and Moretti's relentless pursuit of the truth, she knew her carefully constructed life was unraveling. Julia's nerves were fraying. Every night she found herself staring at the photo of her standing over David's body, wondering how she had been so careless. Who could have been there? Why hadn't she seen them? And what did they really want? Her fear turned to paranoia. She stopped sleeping, convinced that someone was watching her. But then, one night, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Julia received a call. It was a blocked number, and the voice on the other end was masked with a voice modulator, cold and robotic. "You've received my letters," the voice said. "It's time to talk." Julia's throat tightened. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Someone who knows what you did and someone who isn't interested in your money." Julia's heart pounded. "What do you want?" There was a long pause. "Isabella is innocent," the voice finally said. "And if you don't confess, I will make sure you go down instead." Before Julia could respond, the line went dead. Her blood ran cold. The voice wasn't interested in blackmailing her for money. They wanted justice. And suddenly she realized this wasn't just about the affair or the murder. This was someone who had a personal vendetta against her. But who could it be? Who would have the motive and the opportunity to target her like this? As she racked her brain, one name emerged from the chaos of her thoughts. Vincent Moretti. Isabella's lawyer was relentless, unshakable, and had been digging into her life for weeks. But why? What was his stake in this? And then it hit her. Moretti had once been involved with David's business dealings. He had been a close associate, someone David had worked with and trusted. Could he have been in love with Isabella, or perhaps had his own reasons for wanting to take down Julia? Julia realized with a sickening clarity that Moretti wasn't just defending Isabella. He was orchestrating the entire game. He knew everything, and now he was forcing Julia into a corner, using the blackmail to break her before the trial. Faced with Moretti's relentless pursuit, Julia decided to confront him directly. She arranged a meeting at his office under the pretense of discussing a settlement, but when she arrived, her true intentions were clear. She wasn't there to negotiate. She was there to get answers. Moretti sat across from her, his expression calm and unreadable. "Julia, I'm surprised you wanted to meet in person." Julia, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage, wasted no time. "You've been blackmailing me," she hissed. "You're the one sending the letters, aren't you?" Moretti's face remained impassive. "Blackmail. Julia, you've been under a lot of stress. Perhaps you're imagining things." "Don't play games with me," Julia snapped. "I know it's you. You've been setting me up from the start. What do you want from me?" Moretti leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is about me, about money or revenge? You're wrong, Julia. This isn't about blackmail. This is about justice. David was a monster and you were his perfect accomplice." Julia's heart raced. "What are you talking about?" "David didn't just cheat on you," Moretti said, his voice cold. "He ruined lives. He manipulated people, destroyed careers, and left a trail of devastation in his wake. And you?" He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You stood by and let it happen. You benefited from it." Julia's breath caught in her throat. "I didn't know you knew," Moretti interrupted. "And now you're going to pay for it. You'll confess to David's murder, or I'll make sure you go down for far worse." Julia stared at him, realization dawning. Moretti wasn't just after justice for Isabella. He was after David's entire legacy. He wanted to tear down everything David had built, and Julia was the final piece of the puzzle. In that moment, Julia knew there was no escape. Moretti had her trapped, and no matter what she did, she would lose. But before she could respond, Moretti's final bombshell dropped. "You think I've been blackmailing you?" he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "You should be asking yourself who really sent those letters, Julia, because it wasn't me." Julia's eyes widened in horror as the truth finally clicked. The real blackmailer was still out there. In the days following her confrontation with Moretti, Julia became consumed with finding the real blackmailer. She had underestimated the situation entirely. The truth, far more twisted than she could have imagined, was lurking just beneath the surface, and when the blackmailer finally revealed themselves, the truth shattered her reality in the most unexpected and deadly way. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.